What you are about to hear was not declassified. It was reconstructed from fragments of institutional memory that were never meant to survive the people who produced them. The difference matters. Declassified information is information the state chose to release. What follows is information the state believed it had destroyed. There is a category of human experiment that does not appear in standard Cold War historiography, not because it did not happen, but because the methodology used to erase it was more sophisticated than the methodology used to document it. The program this transmission concerns operated under at least 4 separate cover names between 1951 and 1974. Its final designation, recovered from a single surviving internal memo, was Project Naomi. Its subject was not a weapon. It was not a pathogen. It was not a delivery system. Its subject was the sleeping human mind. And what the program discovered inside that mind, what it documented, exploited, and ultimately attempted to seal inside institutional silence, is what this transmission exists to recover. To understand why the sleeping mind became a Cold War asset, you need to understand specific fear that drove American intelligence in 1950. It was not the fear of nuclear attack. That fear was managed, quantified, deterred. The fear that generated programs like Project Naomi was something older and less containable. It was a fear of the converted subject. The fear that a human being, a soldier, an operative, a civilian with access to sensitive infrastructure, could be altered at the level of their foundational beliefs without their knowledge or consent. That the architecture of a person's loyalty, their sense of self, their understanding of what was real, could be reconstructed from the outside. Soviet psychological research capture from the Eastern Front suggested this was not merely theoretical. The documents indicated that certain states of reduced consciousness, states resembling but distinct from ordinary sleep, created windows of neurological access that no waking defense mechanism could close. The first sanctioned experiments began at a facility operating under civilian hospital cover in Montreal, Canada, in 1951. The lead researcher was a Scottish-born psychiatrist named Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, who held positions at McGill University and the Allen Memorial Institute simultaneously, a dual institutional identity that was itself a kind of operational cover. Cameron was not recruited for his politics. He was recruited for a single paper he had published in 1949, in which he described a process he called psychic driving. The theory was precise if disturbing. Cameron had observed that patients in prolonged sedated states showed a measurable reduction in what he termed psychic resistance, their capacity to reject, filter, or reframe incoming information. In this reduced state, repeated audio messages delivered continuously over days or weeks appear to alter not just mood or behavior, but foundational self-concept. The patient's identity, Cameron wrote, became temporarily plastic. The question the men who contacted him were asking was, how plastic could it become? And could the plasticity be directed? The answer Cameron provided, over the course of more than a decade of funded experimentation, was one of the most consequential and suppressed findings in the history of applied psychology. But before we reach that answer, you need to understand what the experiments actually look like from the inside, because most accounts of this program reduce it to its conclusions, to what was done and what was learned. What is almost never examined is the phenomenological record, the fragmentary notes, the transcribed observations, the accounts of what the subjects reported experiencing during and after the induced states. That record, assembled from multiple archival sources, describes something that the program's administrators did not fully anticipate, something that appeared consistently across subjects regardless of age, gender, background, or the specific combination of sedatives used to induce the state. Something that caused at least 3 senior researchers to request reassignment and 2 others to destroy their own notes. What the subjects reported was not absence. It was not darkness. It was not the blank unconsciousness of ordinary sleep. They reported presence, a structured navigable interior space, and something within it that appeared to be aware of them. We will return to that detail. But first, the mechanism, because the mechanism is the architecture of everything that followed. Cameron's procedure, as it evolved through the mid-1950s, involved 3 sequential phases. The first phase was depatterning. The subject was placed in continuous pharmacological sedation using a rotating combination of barbiturates and chlorpromazine, with periods of induced insulin coma at intervals of 2 to 3 weeks. The objective of depatterning was explicit in Cameron's own documentation: the dissolution of existing psychic structure, not the suppression of thought, the erasure of the patterns that made thought coherent. Subjects in successful depatterning states lost, progressively, their ability to maintain continuous autobiographical narrative. They could not reliably locate themselves in time. They could not reconstruct the sequence of their own life events. In the most advanced cases, they could not sustain a stable sense of personal identity across the span of a single conversation. The person who had entered the facility, Cameron noted with clinical detachment, was no longer available. The substrate remained. The pattern had been cleared. The second phase was psychic driving. Into the cleared substrate, Cameron introduced material, pre-recorded messages, repeated through speakers placed beneath pillows, inside helmets, through earphones taped in place during sleep. Some messages were negative, targeted destructions of specific self-concepts delivered thousands of times into a mind no longer capable of constructing resistance. Others were constructive, replacement identities, replacement memories, replacement emotional architectures. The sessions ran continuously for 16 to 20 hours per day. Subjects were kept sedated throughout. They had no awareness, in any conventional sense, that the input was occurring, and yet their behavior, when periodically tested by clinical staff, showed unmistakable evidence that the material was being received, processed, and integrated into something that was reorganizing itself below the level of conscious awareness. The third phase was what Cameron called repatterning, the reconstruction of a functional identity from a cleared and driven substrate. This phase was the least documented and the most carefully protected. The operational files covering repatterning were classified at a level above the rest of the program. Several researchers who worked on depatterning and psychic driving were not cleared to review repatterning outcomes. What the available fragments suggest is that repatterning was the phase during which the program's funding agency, not the Canadian medical establishment, but the Central Intelligence Agency, operating through a front organization called Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology, took direct operational control. The subjects of repatterning were not patients receiving experimental treatment. They were, by this point, something the program's internal documents referred to with a clinical term that appears across multiple fragments without definition or qualification. The term was prepared receivers. Prepared receivers. That phrase was not invented for this transmission. It appears in a document fragment recovered from a Freedom of Information Act request filed by journalist John Marks in 1977, 1 year after the Senate's Church Committee had begun dismantling the outer shell of the program that funded Cameron's work. The outer shell had a name most people recognize. It was called MKUltra. But MKUltra was, as its own documentation makes clear, not a program. It was a funding mechanism, an administrative envelope containing over 150 separate research subprojects, of which Cameron's work was only one. The question that the Church Committee never fully resolved, and that subsequent investigation has continued to circle without resolution, is what the prepared receivers were prepared to receive, because the documentation recovered by Marks and others establishes clearly what was done to the subjects. It is almost entirely silent on what was done with them afterward. Here is what the surviving institutional record can confirm about the subjects of Cameron's program. Many of them arrived voluntarily, referred by family physicians for treatment of anxiety, depression, or minor personality disorders. None of them consented to the actual procedure that was performed on them. None of them were informed of the CIA's involvement in their treatment. Many of them were discharged from the Allen Memorial Institute in states of profound and permanent psychological disintegration, unable to recognize family members, unable to perform basic self-care functions, unable to reconstruct the autobiographical continuity that constitutes, in any meaningful sense, a self. The program produced, as a documented byproduct of its primary objectives, a population of individuals whose identities have been erased and incompletely replaced. Some of them spent the remainder of their lives in institutional care. Some of them recovered partial function over years or decades, retaining vast and inexplicable gaps in their personal history, holes in their own timeline that corresponded precisely to the periods of their treatment. Some of them were never found at all. But this transmission is not primarily about the damage. The damage is the part of the story that has been told, partially, in declassified hearings and investigative journalism. The damage is the accessible layer. What this transmission is concerned with is what lies beneath the accessible layer, the thing that kept appearing in the phenomenological reports, the thing that made researchers request reassignment, the structured interior space, the presence within it, and the series of anomalous findings from the later phase of the program. Findings that do not appear in any Senate hearing record, any Freedom of Information disclosure, or any published academic account of MKUltra or its sub-projects, that suggested the sleeping human mind was not merely a system to be altered. It was a system that was already, in some fashion that the program's researchers could not adequately frame within their existing scientific vocabulary, in contact with something external to the individual subject. This segment contained only the surface structure of the record, the administrative history, the documented mechanism, the named institutions, and the quantifiable damage. What was found inside the cleared substrate, what the subject encountered in the space between depatterning and repatterning, and what the program's hidden directorate concluded it meant. That layer was sealed under a classification designation that did not officially exist. It has been reconstructed. The continuation has been archived separately. If you are receiving this transmission, you're already cleared for what follows.